In today's video, I'm excited to have two of 2024's most sought after monitors, the Asus ROG Swift PG32UCD and the MSI MPG 321URX. These are both 32-inch 4K OLED panels featuring up to 1000 nits of peak brightness and a 240 Hz refresh rate. These specs are, to put it mildly, highly sought after and for many represent what could be the perfect monitor. So are they? Well, in this video, I'm going to give each a brief overview and put them head to head to see how they compare. First though, let's quickly say why these guys are so exciting. So for many of us, OLED is the best display technology on the market currently. See, unlike traditional LCDs, OLEDs use emissive pixel elements, giving us perfect blacks and infinite contrast. The downside has always been, at least in the current monitor space, availability and cost. See, while OLEDs have been available in the TV market for over 20 years, it's only been within the last few that they've been made specifically for PCs, and even less time since they've been, well, actually good. Early OLEDs were expensive, and at the time when most LCDs were making the jump to 4K and high refresh rates, remained stubbornly at 60 Hz and with lower resolution. And that's what makes these guys so exciting. You get all of the advancements LEDs have enjoyed over the years with almost none of their drawbacks. More importantly, while these guys are marketed as gaming screens, the reality is they're not. They're actually good at everything. They have plenty of brightness and clarity for office work, color accuracy for content creation, and fast refresh rates and response times for gaming. They're not perfect, of course, but I'll save that for the end. In short though, these screens are colorful, accurate, fast, and an absolute joy to use. If you're in the market for a 4K 32-inch monitor, these should be at the top of your list. So as far as a comparison then, well, first things first, we're going head-to-head specifically because both of these guys use the exact same QD OLED panel from Samsung. And as a result, I found almost no difference in image quality. Your buying decision is going to come down to price, aesthetics, and software. Now the Asus currently sells for $1,299 US, the MSI for $950. So what does that extra money buy? So let's go head to head. First, let's start with firmware. So with firmware, it's typically not something I'd consider as part of a normal review. Usually you just plug in your monitor and it works. But unfortunately, with both of these guys, well, they're coming in a bit hot. The Asus shipped with MCM 101, the latest is 103. Updating to that newest version was simple, just download and run a self-executing file. The biggest problems being solved have to do with the monitor HDR brightness and some minor connectivity issues. While these fixes have helped, there are outstanding issues with some HDR modes, but fixes appear to be imminent. The MSI has had a single update, once again having to do with resolving HDR issues. Unlike the Asus, however, updates require a rather large download of a utility application and somewhat unforgivably nag you to install bloatware. The utility app is easy enough to remove, but because of the lame installer tricks, I vastly prefer Asus's method. Let's talk panel. So as noted earlier, both monitors use the same second-gen Samsung QD OLED panel. Based on the price premium of the Asus, however, I was curious to see if there was any type of panel lottery going on. For my time with each, no. Both are nearly identical in terms of sharpness, color reproduction, responsiveness, accuracy, and so on. That said, I will say the MSI does seem to have a slight advantage with text clarity and contrast in HDR mode, but not SDR. I'll cover the reasons why in just a little bit. Let's talk on-screen display. So for OSD appearance, I prefer the colorful, modern aesthetic of the MSI. The MSI display is noticeably larger than the Asus, which considering the 32-inch screen size is kind of puzzling. Let's talk on-screen display. So for OSD appearance, I prefer the colorful, modern aesthetic of the MSI. The MSI display is noticeably larger than the Asus, which considering the 32-inch screen size is kind of puzzling. That said, both use the modern joystick method of navigation, which is to say a single button with a directional control located behind the monitor at the bottom center. The menus themselves are easy to navigate, though the Asus loads its menu almost twice as fast as the MSI, and is also noticeably faster to navigate within menu pages. Overall, while the Asus OSD is smaller, it's more enjoyable to use because of how snappy it is. For connectivity, both feature a wealth of input options, including HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort 1.4, and USB-C. Both provide power via that USB-C port, though the Asus allows you to select between 60 and 90 watts. Curiously, if you choose the 90 watt option, the Asus limits your brightness to 65. The MSI appears to deliver the full 90 watts without this limitation. Input switching is just a touch faster on the Asus, though both feature an integrated KVM if you're serious about multi-machine setups. For us Mac users, unlike some gaming-specific monitors I've used in the past, both displays work perfectly with my MacBook Pro. They're recognized by their native model names, and key features like HDR, resolution scaling, and variable refresh rate work perfectly. If I had one small nickel, it's that macOS doesn't handle the non-standard sub-pixel layout of these panels as well as Windows. The end result is text appears to have just a bit more fringing than in Windows, but it's by no means a deal breaker. Just don't expect the same level of sharpness you get from the Pro displays or your high DPI laptop screen. In the looks department, both monitors feature what I'd call a mild gamer aesthetic, which in this case means RGB displays on the back panels, and for the Asus, a lower bump with, and this is important, an optional RGB graphic. Yes, you can turn it off if you don't like it, which is a really nice touch. Of the two backside RGB displays, I prefer the Asus. The pixelated logo is colorful and doesn't really scream gamer to me, more of a cool little graphic element. By contrast, the MSI is rather basic with just an RGB backlight of the MSI logo. Perhaps more importantly, if you're in a setting where you'll see the back of these monitors and you use VESA mounting, the MSI doesn't look great. It has this large gap of exposed plastic, whereas the Asus has a more professional finished appearance. Moving to the front, being OLED, both monitors use pixels that extend past the active display. The idea being the display image is slowly and subtly shifted around these normally unlit areas to help prevent image burn-in and retention. You don't really notice this area in normal use, but it does mean the borders on these monitors are a little bit bigger than traditional LCDs. One thing I'm not a huge fan of, and this is really small, but on both displays, the top and side bezels are unequal, with the top being a touch smaller than the sides. It's small, but it's just something I notice. The bottom bezel though, well, that's where the screens show the biggest difference. The MSI uses a relatively attractive gray strip that's spoiled by this large MSI logo. I find the Asus's all black bezel far more refined and honestly pleasing to the eye. So let's talk performance. For pure SDR performance, that is non-HDR, they're unsurprisingly identical. On the software side, both have decent selection of controls for image customization, though I would give the nod here to Asus for its ability to set gamma curves and a better control over individual color channels. For HDR performance, well, this is where some of the real changes start coming in. So the HDR performance of each monitor is similar/identical, though each takes a slightly different path to get there. And once again, the software is going to play the biggest role here. So the MSI has two HDR modes, defaulting to Display HDR 400 True Black, with the second option being Peak 1000. As the name suggests, 400 True Black limits peak brightness to 400 nits, Peak 1000, well, 1000. By contrast, the Asus features four HDR modes, the default being Console HDR, along with Cinema HDR, Gaming HDR, and as with the MSI, Display HDR 400 True Black. The Display 400 modes on both provides the same image, which we'd expect. The other HDR modes, at least as of firmware 103 on the Asus, are quite similar. Gaming HDR seems the brightest, with Cinema and Console HDR appearing almost identical to my eye. From my read of the Asus support forums, this is where a lot of the complaints and work for the next firmware version is going. I'll post a new video when we see how this shakes out. For the sake of comparison though, both monitors in terms of HDR brightness are again nearly identical. The brightest Asus mode seems to be a close match for the MSI's Peak 1000. For all their similarities though, there are two significant differences when it comes to HDR image quality and usefulness. The first is sharpness. Now the MSI has a setting called sharpness that defaults to 0. The Asus has a similar sharpness setting, only they call it vivid pixel. On the Asus, vivid pixel defaults to 50, bumping this to 100 matches the 0 sharpness setting of the MSI. So in other words, the Asus starts quite soft and goes to what MSI considers its minimum sharpness. Of course, this means the MSI will get much sharper than the Asus, but that also means if you find the MSI too sharp, you're out of luck. And if you find the Asus too soft, you're also out of luck. This seems like a simple firmware fix for both though, just to expand the sharpness ranges, and hopefully they'll do that soon. Speaking of one flaw of Asus's current firmware, its switching into HDR softens the image. This means if you find HDR too soft and set vivid pixel to 100, going back to SDR creates an overly sharp image. Not a great look, and hopefully again that's something they fix. The next big difference is color. So although the Asus has 4 HDR modes, they don't actually affect color, only tone mapping and brightness. This means the Asus has 1 color setting for HDR. By contrast, the MSI has 8. This means the MSI gives you more ways to color HDR presentation. The settings are within this professional menu, and from my experience, that's actually a great name for this. My professional LG monitor also allows me to select color modes in HDR, only for broadcast standards like BT 2020. It's really nice that MSI allows you to do this, and it is almost kind of like a professional feature. In summary, identical panels in performance, but key differences in software and looks. For me, I strongly prefer the look of the Asus, so that's my pick. At the same time, if looks aren't the only part of the equation, the $300 premium of the Asus display may not actually be worth it. The Asus has better color controls in SDR and a much faster OSD on-screen display. So if you're switching inputs often or in the OSD on a regular basis, the Asus is a clear pick. On the other hand, the MSI gives you more flexibility with HDR color. So which to get? I would say if you're into gaming and are okay with MSI's look, I'd go for that. If you have a more rounded set of needs, including multiple inputs and color work, the Asus is my pick. Now I said a little bit earlier in this video, are these perfect displays? And the short version is not quite yet. In other words, if you're looking for the perfect display and you don't ever want to buy another monitor again, short of it like, just stopping working, these aren't quite there yet. And there's really 2 reasons for that. The first reason is the resolution, while good at 4K, I think the perfect monitor is going to be around 6K at the 32-inch size. We're not quite there yet, but we'll hopefully get there soon. The other big flaw of these monitors, and by flaw I just mean compared to what you can get in the LCD space, is brightness. So 1000 nits is nothing to sneeze at. In a dark room, I think that's all you probably need. But if you're in a brighter room and you're gaming, or you're doing work where you really want to see like that punchy sizzleness of HDR displays, these are close, but they're not quite there. And so my recommendation would be 1600 nits. That's what this MacBook Pro screen behind me is, and I do not find myself needing more brightness than that. And so that'd be my summary. I think we need a little bit more brightness and we need a little bit more resolution, and once we get there, provided the OLEDs don't suffer from severe burn-in and things like that, we will truly have the perfect display. So thanks as always for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. We will be doing some follow-up videos on the Asus specifically to see how that firmware shakes out. Thanks as always for watching.